Hello and welcome. Long before Elminster, Omar earned the title of Sage of Shadowdale. Before the world came to know his name as something practically synonymous with ancient wisdom and arcane power beyond any ordinary reckoning. He was a frightened boy returning at night to a village that had been destroyed while he was away from it, reaching into the rubble and ash with shaking hands to take his father's broken sword. That image, a child kneeling in the debris of everything he had known, lifting a shattered blade in the dark as the only inheritance left to him, is where this great sage's story truly begins. Not in triumph, not in the amber-lit comfort of a wizard's study, surrounded by centuries of accumulated learning, but in ash and loss, and the particular, devastating kind of grief that does not simply wound a person. It tears them open and forces something entirely new to grow in the wound. Tonight, we are going back to the very beginning of that transformation. We are going back to Athlanter. Before we start our journey, please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the surest way to find your path back to our library of lore when you wake. Section 1: The Kingdom Before the Storm. You have to understand what Athlanter was, what it genuinely felt like to breathe its air and walk its roads, before you can carry any real understanding of what it meant for that kingdom to fall. Athlanter sat nestled in the broad green lands, where the Unicorn Run cut its path south toward the Delimbier, a realm of rolling meadows and ancient forests where old trees grew so thick and tall that on clear mornings the sunlight fell through their canopy in long, slow shafts of gold, laying patterns of light and shadow across the mossy earth below that shifted with every passing breeze. The rivers that moved through that land came cold and clean from the mountains, and in the villages scattered like quiet heartbeats across the countryside, people lived in the way that ordinary folk have always lived. They tended their fields and raised their children, celebrated the good seasons and endured the hard ones, and they trusted in that simple and unexamined way that the stag banner above the great hall of Haystarl meant that someone above them was watching over things. The stag was the symbol of this kingdom's identity in the deepest sense. Athlanter had been founded in the year 183 of the Dale Reckoning by a man named Uthgrael Omar, the Stag King, a figure who had looked at the scattered and leaderless farming communities of the region and understood that uniting them under one banner would build something worth protecting. The realm he created was never the grandest in all of Faerun, never the most feared at a war council or the most admired in a poet's verse, but it was recognized across the region as a place of reliable order, where the mechanisms of governance turned as they were supposed to turn. Uthgrael's line held to that founding character through the generations that followed him, and the stag became shorthand for a certain kind of steady authority, the respect you give a well-constructed wall, because it was built honestly and holds what it was built to hold. Uthgrael died in the year 216 of the Dale reckoning. Elminster had been alive for only 4 years at that point, far too young to carry any real memory of his grandfather. What followed Uthgrael's death was not a clean succession. There was infighting among the princes of the realm, the particular kind of maneuvering and competing that tends to fill the space left when a strong founding figure is removed, and the structure they built has to prove it can hold without them. Out of that contest, the eldest prince, a man named Balor Omar, took the throne in 218 of the Dale reckoning. The lore is clear on how he managed this. He did not win the throne through broad support or demonstrated leadership. He won it with the help of powerful wizards who had been quietly positioning themselves in the court for years. The same wizards who would later be known as the Magelords of Athlanter. This means something important that is easy to overlook. By the time Elminster was old enough to be genuinely aware of the kingdom he was growing up in, the throne was already occupied by a puppet. The era of the legitimate stag kings had already ended. Balor sat on the stag throne, but the decisions being made in that court were not Balor's decisions. They belonged to the men in robes who had placed him there and intended to keep him there. It is away from that court, in the outlying village of Helden, that you find the man who would become Elminster's father. Prince Elthrin Omar had made a deliberate and considered choice to step back from the intrigues at Haystarl. The lore describes him as a calm, peaceful, and just man, and those qualities likely made the atmosphere of a court, increasingly shaped by magelord manipulation, feel fundamentally incompatible with who he was, rather than engage in the kind of accommodation and maneuvering that remaining in that environment would have required. He withdrew. He went to the village of Helden and became its lord, governing a small community honestly rather than performing at the center of a court that had already been compromised at its foundations. Helden was the kind of settlement that Athlanter was made of at its most fundamental level. A village of working people set into the gentle landscape of the Vale, surrounded by the forests and fields that defined daily life for the vast majority of the kingdom's population. The rhythm of that place was the rhythm of seasons and harvests, and the slow community keeping that small settlements depend on for their cohesion. For Elthrin, it was the right place. Here, there was something real to govern, a community rather than a political arena, a life that could be built on something genuine. He had also brought home a wife, and she was not from the court. Amrithale Goldchief was a forester's daughter, a woman of the land rather than the capital, and that origin shaped who she was in ways that complemented Elthrin's own deliberate simplicity. She was sharp in her thinking and generous in her manner. she could engage a neighbor in genuine conversation and turn around, and reason carefully through a difficult problem in the same afternoon. Because she was simply someone who found people interesting and problems worth examining. When she and Elthrin had their son, she looked into that child's face with the wonder that visits every parent in those first moments, when the full weight of a new and entirely distinct human being settles into your arms for the first time. The world has just changed, and it is never going back to what it was before. That child was Elminster Omar, born in the year of the awakening magic, in the year 212 of the Dale Reckoning. He grew up in Heldon with the ease of a child, whose parents are genuinely good people, in a place where everyone knows everyone else. He was a curious child by every indication, the kind who asked questions that wandered past the comfortable edges of what adults expected, who found that the world had more interesting corners the more carefully he looked into them. His father took him out in the mornings into the forests and fields around Heldon. And in those hours, with the dew-wet grass underfoot and his father's steady voice at his side, Elminster learned to love the land of Athlanter with the deep certainty that only comes when you are young enough to believe it belongs to you permanently. He would have been out there often, among the meadows and the tree lines, doing the ordinary work of a village boy in the countryside, tending the family's animals, learning the shape of the land, growing into it the way children do when the land around them is safe and familiar and theirs. His mother read to him in the evenings tales of distant places and old heroes and strange wonders that existed somewhere beyond the rolling meadows of home. And in those firelit hours, it is easy to picture the boy he was, sitting close to the hearth with the dark pressing quietly against the shuttered windows, believing without any doubt at all that this was simply how things were. The firelight, his mother's voice, his father's presence somewhere nearby, permanent, his, the foundation beneath every other thing. Meanwhile, up in Haystarl, the mage lords were consolidating. They had helped Balor take power, and with that done, the real work of remaking the kingdom from within was ongoing. They threaded themselves into every functional layer of how Athlanter operated, its guard appointments, its tax collection, its lines of supply and communication. The other princes of the Omar family, those who represented potential rallying points for opposition, were systematically removed from the picture over the years that followed. Killed, driven out, made into examples. By the year 224 of the Dale Reckoning, the lore is unambiguous. The mage lords were the true power behind the stag throne, and the only Omar prince who had not yet been dealt with was living quietly in Heldon, raising a boy who liked the fields and the morning mist and his mother's stories by the fire. They had not forgotten about Elthrin, and they had not forgotten about his son. The golden years in Helden were real. You should hold on to that, because they were genuinely beautiful, and they were genuinely his. But the thing that was coming was already moving toward that village with a clear purpose, in the form of a man on a dragon who had been assigned a task he intended to complete. Neither the boy, nor his careful father, nor his brilliant mother had any way of seeing it yet. Section 2. The night everything ended. The day Undarl came to Helden began the way all the worst days do, with nothing in the air to distinguish it from the ones that came before. Elminster would have been out in the open country, surrounding the village that morning. He was a boy who spent his days in those meadows and tree lines, in the way that children in working rural settlements have always spent them, close to the land, close to the animals that needed tending, moving through the familiar landscape of his earliest years, with the comfortable ease of someone who has walked the same paths so many times that they have become as natural as breathing. The fields east of Helden were his ordinary world. The sound of the village going about its morning, the voices carrying across the distance, the thin columns of cook-fire smoke rising into the still air, were all part of the background of his life, so constant and so unremarkable that he would have stopped truly hearing them the way you stop truly hearing the sounds of a room you have lived in long enough. He would have felt Undarl before he saw him. There is a detail in the lore worth carrying here. Even as a boy, before any training or study or conscious development of any kind, Elminster possessed an innate quality that would later be understood as one of the first signs of his extraordinary magical nature. He could detect magical auras, not through any deliberate act or practiced skill, simply as a passive and ever-present sense, the way some people are acutely aware of changes in atmospheric pressure or the direction of wind. Something vast and hostile and steeped in the art was moving through the air toward Helden, and some part of him felt it arriving with the full body certainty that precedes rational understanding. He looked up. Undarl the dragon rider, Mage Royal of Athelanter, came to Helden from above on the back of a dragon. What the lore preserves of this moment carries none of the narrative ornament of a dramatic confrontation between equals. This was not that kind of event. There was no opponent waiting for Undarl in Helden who could have made it one. What descended on that village was simply overwhelming force, applied to the problem of eliminating a threat the magelords had decided they could no longer afford to leave unaddressed. Elthrin Omar, Lord of Helden and Prince of Athelanter, had always represented a potential rallying point. A legitimate Omar, a figure with a genuine claim to the stag throne. Someone who, if circumstances shifted or the right person found him at the right moment, could become the center of a resistance that the mage lords would find very inconvenient. Undarl had come to ensure that such circumstances never developed. He had come with a dragon, because a dragon leaves no ambiguity. Elminster, standing out in the fields with nothing in his hands that would have made any difference, and no way to reach the village before what was already happening had finished happening, watched his home burn. He would not reach what I think is the full horror of that moment if we try to describe it too precisely. There is a kind of experience that resists the architecture of description, that exists in its truest form only as a physical sensation, the specific quality of helplessness that belongs to watching destruction at a distance you cannot close, with your body already moving toward it and your legs already knowing they will arrive too late. He ran. Of course he ran. And the distance between him and Helden remained exactly what it was, indifferent to his need. By the time he could do anything, there was nothing left to do. He came back to Helden at night, moving through the dark toward the place where the fires had subsided into the low, persistent glow of things that had been burning long enough to run out of what they needed to keep burning. The smell reached him before the sight did, that specific combination of burned wood and scorched earth, and something beneath both of those that a person's mind tends to work very hard not to identify directly. The village was gone, not damaged, not diminished, but gone, in the comprehensive way that only the particular combination of dragon and deliberate magical destruction can achieve. The lore describes Helden as decimated, almost the entire population lost. His father among them, Elthrin Omar, the calm and principled man who had chosen a quiet village over a compromised court, who had raised his son in the good air of honest country life, and walked with him through the morning mist, and been the steady voice at his side through the years that shape a person permanently, was dead. So was Amrathale Goldchief. So was the warmth, and the firelight, and the evening stories, and every physical arrangement of the world that had constituted Elminster's life up to this moment. What he did in the ruin of Helden that night was take his father's sword. The lion's sword was the sword of state for Athelanter, a symbol of the great king of the stag throne, a weapon whose meaning extended far beyond its function as a blade. That it was broken, the blade shattered, the weapon reduced by the violence of the night to a fragment of what it had been designed to be, carries a weight that the lore does not need to comment on directly. A 12-year-old boy moving through the ruins of his family's village, finding his father's body in the dark, lifting the broken remnant of a symbol of everything that had been taken, and carrying it away as the only inheritance left to him. There is nothing to add to that image. It speaks for itself, in the way that only images gathered from real grief tend to speak. He carried the broken sword, and he walked away from Helden into the dark. He did not have a destination. He had only the direction away from the smoke and the ruin, and the unbearable closeness of everything he had just lost. He moved because staying was impossible, and because a 12-year-old body in a state of crisis keeps walking when it cannot do anything else. The road he found himself on in those hours was not a road to anywhere specific. It was simply the next field, and the one after that, and the tree line beyond that, and eventually the long, cold dark of the countryside with the village behind him, growing more distant and no other light in any direction. He was found by Helm Stoneblade. The lore does not give us a detailed account of precisely how and where that meeting occurred, but what it preserves is the substance of it. Helm Stoneblade was a man whose own loyalty to the Omar line had survived everything the magelords had done to make such loyalty dangerous. A hardened figure who had ended up among a company of outlaws known as the Knights of Athlanter. Men and women who had been pushed outside the law of the magelord regime and had made their home in the Horn Hills, a rough and difficult stretch of terrain that offered the particular advantage of being very inconvenient for anyone who wanted to come in after them. Helm knew who this boy was. When he found young Elminster, or when Elminster found him, what passed between them in the hours that followed was the beginning of an education. Helm told him the history of the Omar royal family. He laid out for the boy the shape of what had happened to Athlanter, not in the simplified terms adults sometimes use when speaking to children about difficult things, but in the full and factual terms of someone who understood that this particular child needed to understand the full reality of what he was living inside if he was going to survive it. He told him about Balor on the stag throne, his uncle, the man who had accepted the magelord's arrangement and been rewarded with the appearance of power in exchange. He told him about the systematic elimination of the other Omar princes over the years since the magelords had cemented their hold. He told him what that meant for the 12-year-old standing in front of him, carrying a broken sword. He warned him never to speak his true name. Elminster Omar, Prince of Athlanter, last surviving heir of the stag throne, became simply a boy without a name on the public road. He went with Helm to the Horn Hills and into the rough, informal company of the Knights of Athlanter, a group whose connection to the Old Kingdom was kept alive not through any official structure, but through the shared will of people who had refused to accept the present arrangement as permanent. They were brigands in the practical sense. They took what they needed. They operated outside the law of a regime, whose law they did not recognize as legitimate. There was a justice in that refusal, however imperfect its expression, and Elminster felt it as the closest thing to purpose that the weeks following Helden had offered him. He was not processing the grief. He was not capable of processing it yet, and the life he had just entered did not create conditions where processing was available. He was surviving, and survival in those Horn Hills had a specific and demanding curriculum. He learned to fight. He learned to move through difficult terrain without being heard or tracked. He learned the quick, pragmatic calculations of a person whose safety depends on reading a situation accurately and acting before the situation resolves against them. The calm, curious boy who had listened to his mother's stories by the fire was still in there, packed somewhere beneath the hardening exterior that the weeks and months were building over him. He had not disappeared. He was simply waiting, the way certain things wait in the dark, until the right conditions arrive for them to be visible again. Somewhere in the dark of the Horn Hills, in the cold hours that came after the fires of camp had burned low, and the company around him had gone to whatever rest outlaws manage, he held the broken lion's sword and understood something that had no adequate words yet, that the shape of his future was not yet visible, that what Helm had told him about the Omar line and the Mage Lords and the Stag Throne was now, whether he chose it or not, part of who he was. That the sword in his hands was not simply a broken blade. It was a direction. Even shattered, it pointed somewhere. He could not have said yet where, but the direction was there, and it was already pulling. Section 3, The Hawk of the Roads. The years in the Horn Hills made him harder in the ways that living rough and fighting for survival will always make a person harder. And they taught him things that no other education could have given him. Helm's Stoneblade and the Knights of Athlanter were not a romantic band of heroes, patiently waiting for their moment to ride back into history. They were outlaws by necessity, men and women who had been pushed outside every system the Mage Lords ran, and had concluded that the only honest response to that exclusion was to refuse it entirely. They operated from the rough terrain of the Horn Hills, a landscape of broken ridges and dense undergrowth that rewarded people who knew how to move through it quietly and punished those who did not. Elminster spent several years in that company, from the age of 12 through his mid-teens, absorbing the combative education that Helm and the others had to offer. He learned to use a blade with real intent. He learned to track and be tracked, and to understand the difference between the two. He learned what it meant to act from within a group that depended on each member's competence for the safety of all. And he learned what it cost when someone in that group failed that dependence. But what the Horn Hills years also gave him, alongside the physical hardening and the combative education, was a sustained and accumulating encounter with his own unwillingness to kill. This is one of the more genuinely surprising details in the early arc of Elminster's story. the boy who had every reason to want to be dangerous, who carried a broken sword as the symbol of everything that had been violently taken from him, found that the actual practice of killing did not sit comfortably inside him. It was not squeamishness. He was not afraid of the work. He simply understood, in the particular and inarguable way that direct experience teaches things, that he had no genuine appetite for it. That something in him resisted the repeated taking of life as a primary instrument, regardless of the justification available. By the time he was around 16 years of age, he had grown weary of that life in a way that went past ordinary tiredness and into something more fundamental. He left the Knights of Athlanter and the Horn Hills behind. Helm would remain a figure in his story, as we will see. The Knights would remain relevant. But for now, Elminster was moving away from the rough terrain and the company of outlaws and heading toward the city, toward Haystarl. He arrived in the capital of Athlanter, carrying the name Aladar the Dark, a street identity he had constructed with the deliberate care of someone who understood very clearly that his real name was the most dangerous thing he could carry. The city received him the way cities receive every young person arriving with nothing but capability and need, impersonally and without ceremony, simply folding him into the existing population and leaving him to find his footing or fail too. He found his footing. Haystarl under the Magelords had a quality to it that was different from the oppressive atmosphere of the rural kingdom, in ways that were both better and worse. It was louder, more crowded, more layered in its daily movement, and that density provided genuine cover. In a city this size, one more young man of no apparent social position was genuinely invisible in a way that the open countryside of the Horn Hills could never entirely offer. But the Magelord's presence in Haystarl was also more concentrated than it was in the outlying villages and roads. This was the center of their operation. The court of Balor, Omar sat here, the puppet king performing the ceremonial functions of kingship, while the men in robes made the actual decisions. The mage hounds who moved through the kingdom's countryside had their coordination point here. The tax apparatus, the enforcement structure, the appointment of every official who held any meaningful administrative position in Athlanter. All of it ran through Haystarl. The streets showed it. There was commerce here, because commerce does not entirely stop even under bad governance, but it moved with a particular caution. Merchants weighed their words in public the way they weighed their coins in private, with careful attention to exact quantity and a clear awareness of the consequences of miscalculation. The taverns and common rooms were spaces of managed sociability, where people engaged in the ordinary pleasures of shared food and drink and conversation, but kept the conversation in the shallower waters, where everything said could be safely defended if it was ever repeated to the wrong person. The mage hounds who walked Haystarl streets in pairs did not need to do anything dramatic to maintain this atmosphere. Their simple presence was sufficient. Everyone knew what they were and what they did. Nobody wanted to give them a reason to stop walking and look more carefully in any particular direction. The Moonclaws moved through this city as something almost like a sanctioned presence. They were a thieves' gang, technically operating outside the law, but in the specific way that certain criminal organizations operating under complicit governance occupy an ambiguous position. They were servants of the mage lords in everything that mattered. They moved information up the chain. They eliminated inconvenient people when the mage lords needed an elimination that carried no official fingerprints. They enforced the kind of low-level social pressure that keeps populations from organizing in ways that might become inconvenient to the people who actually run things. Their black leathers with the crossed dagger and moon emblem were recognized on Haystarl streets, and that recognition functioned exactly as intended. It was in contrast to the Moonclaws that the Velvet Hands defined themselves. Farrell ran the Velvet Hands, and Farrell was the kind of person that Haystarl's underbelly occasionally produced. Someone with a genuine operational mind for the work of thieving. A functional moral compass that operated outside conventional categories. And a quality of easy companionship that made people around him want to be useful to him rather than simply be used by him. He and Elminster, who he knew only as Aladar the Dark, found in each other a complementary competence. Farrell was already running a small but effective operation. Elminster brought to it a physical capability and a quickness of reading and reacting to situations that expanded what the gang could attempt. They pulled off heists together. They robbed from the wealthy and the corrupt, and occasionally from people who were neither. Because the work of surviving in a city operated on a more pragmatic ethics than any clean principle could fully account for. And Elminster was honest enough with himself to know it. The Velvet Hands grew into a real operation, a thieves' guild with a presence in Haystarl, and an ongoing antagonism with the Moonclaws that was partly professional and partly principled, in the sense that opposing the servants of the mage lords in any capacity felt, to Elminster and to Farrell and to those around them who shared their particular alignment, like the least they could do. It was not resistance in any organized or strategic sense. It was closer to refusal, the daily, practical refusal to let the machinery of the Mage Lord City run entirely unchallenged. He was good at this life. He was genuinely, demonstrably good at it, in ways that went beyond the competence required to simply survive, and into a quality of excellence that the work rewarded. His hands were quick. His mind was quicker. He could enter a building, and move through it with a silence that was close to eerie in someone with no magical training whatsoever, which, given what lived latently in him, may not have been entirely coincidental. Based on what we know about his innate magical nature, it seems likely that the sensitivity that allowed him to detect arcane auras from a young age also gave him an involuntary awareness of his environment that exceeded ordinary human perception. He could feel a room in ways that are difficult to articulate through purely physical explanation. And then one night during a burglary, he met the Magister. His name was Dorgan Stonecloak Himalathter. The title of Magister in the traditions of Faerun's magical community is not a courtesy or a regional honorific. It is the formal title given to a specific and singular individual, the one who is recognized at any given time as the foremost independent wizard in the world, a title maintained through challenge and combat, and the kind of reputation that does not attach itself to anyone who has not genuinely earned it. Dorgan held that title. He was in Haystarl that night for reasons the lore does not fully illuminate, and he encountered Elminster in the middle of a job, in the particular kind of meeting that happens when two people who were both intending to be somewhere in secret find that they are somewhere in secret together. The conversation that followed, for all its improbable setting, became one of the quiet pivots of the whole story. Dorgan recognized something in the young thief standing across from him, that innate and undeveloped magical quality that any serious practitioner of the art could sense in the presence of genuine potential. He offered, with the kind of directness that belongs to a person who has been the most powerful independent wizard alive long enough to have left most social ceremony behind, to teach Elminster magic. Elminster refused. He refused with the full weight of everything the last several years had built in him: the burning village, and the broken sword, and the Horn Hills, and the Moonclaws, and every gray-faced farmer, and every disappeared neighbor, and every magehound walking Haystarl streets in a posture of casual authority. He refused because magic was the instrument of all of it, because the face of magical power in his entire conscious experience was the face of Undarl on a dragon, and the face of the men in robes who sat behind Balor's throne and made decisions that cost ordinary people their ordinary lives. He could not hear an offer to learn the art without hearing, underneath it, the sound of Helden burning. Dorgan let him go. The Magister did not force the issue, which perhaps says something about him, or perhaps says something about the patience that genuine wisdom sometimes carries in the face of refusal. But the encounter had done something to Elminster's interior state that he would not have been able to fully articulate at the time. Meeting an actual wielder of the art face to face, in a context that removed all the abstracted dread and replaced it with a specific and ordinary human encounter, had brought his hatred to the surface with a freshness and a force that he had not felt with quite that intensity in some time. It had renewed something that had been settling into background noise, and that renewal drove him toward a decision that the calmer version of himself might have deferred or reconsidered. He decided to act against the magelords directly. The precise shape of what he attempted is the kind of detail where the various sources blur at the edges. But what the lore preserves is clear enough in its outcome. He moved toward the magelord operation in Haystarl with the intention of striking at it in some meaningful way. And somewhere in the course of that movement, he found himself at a sealed and derelict temple of Mistra, a building that had been shut and emptied of its community by the magelord prohibition on Mistran worship. Its doors dark and its halls silent in the way of a space that has been deliberately hollowed out. He broke in. He was not alone inside for long. Section 4. Elmara, priestess of Mistra. The sealed temple of Mistra stood in one of Haystarl's older quarters, in the particular way that suppressed things tend to stand, present, but quieted, its doors locked, and its windows dark, stripped of the community that had once given it a living purpose. The magelords had been methodical about their suppression of Mistra's faith. They understood, in the specific and self-interested way, that people who hold power through the art tend to understand such things, that an active and organized religious community devoted to the goddess of magic represented a relationship with the weave that operated entirely outside their control. They could not permit that. They had therefore closed the temples, disbanded the priesthoods, and made the open worship of the Lady of Mysteries something that cost a person their safety in Athlanter. This was, from the outside, exactly what Elminster saw. A closed temple, a building emptied of its meaning, and its people by the same hands that had emptied his life of the people who gave it meaning. His intention that night was not reverential. The lore records it plainly. He broke in to defile the place. Whether that impulse came from a desire to strike symbolically at one of the structures the magelords had claimed as a demonstration of their power, or from a broader and less focused rage at anything connected to the art and the world of magic, or from some combination of both, is something we can reasonably infer from everything the story has shown us about where Elminster was at this point in his life. What is clear is that he went in with contempt rather than caution, which is perhaps the most dangerous combination available to a person moving through a space they do not understand. He was not alone inside. A mage was already in the temple. The lore does not record who this person was, or what business had brought them to a sealed and derelict Mistran temple in the middle of the night. But the practical result of their presence was immediate. They saw Elminster, and they prepared to kill him. What happened next was not Elminster's doing. Mystra intervened. She saved him from the mage with a directness that left no room for ambiguity about who was acting and for whose benefit. The intervention was not subtle or gentle. It was the full attention of a goddess, focused on a specific moment in a specific room, and it resolved the immediate threat. The mage was no longer in control of the situation, and Elminster, who had just had his life saved by the divine power of the goddess, whose temple he had broken into in order to defile it, was left standing in the dark with the particular quality of silence that follows a moment when everything changes at once. Mystra did not let the moment pass without words. What passed between them in that sealed temple is one of the genuinely remarkable exchanges in Elminster's entire centuries-long story, and the lore preserves its essential shape. She gave him a choice. The mage who had been about to kill him was now in her power. She offered Elminster the opportunity to slay the mage himself, to take the life of someone who had, by any ordinary accounting of the situation, earned whatever came next by trying to kill a young man whose only crime that evening was criminal trespass. She gave him the choice, and then she watched what he did with it. He debated with her, genuinely, openly, not performing a virtue, but working through an actual problem with the kind of direct and unornamented honesty that had always been one of the truest things about him. He argued that using magic, even magic placed in his hands by a goddess and directed at someone who had tried to kill him, was not something he could bring himself to accept as right. Not here, not from this source, not wrapped in this particular history. His refusal to simply take the offered resolution and be satisfied with it says something real about the person he was becoming, even in the middle of the worst years of his life. The anger and the grief and the hardness had not consumed the principled core that Elthrin and Amrathale had built into him in a village by a river in the years before the dragon came. He let the mage go. Mystra had been watching this entire story since before Elminster was born. What she felt in the moment he made that choice. If the interior experience of a goddess can be described in any language that does justice to it, is not something the lore translates directly. But the logic of what happened next implies that it mattered to her. She had been waiting for something from him. Not power, not proficiency, not the full development of the magical potential she had recognized in him from the beginning. She had been waiting for the indication that the person carrying that potential was someone who could be trusted with what she needed to give him. She asked him to serve her. She asked him to become her champion, to turn toward the art rather than away from it, to accept that what he had spent years hating and fearing was not the thing itself, but what the thing had been made into by people whose relationship with it was based on domination and hoarding. She told him that magic was not the Mage Lord's, that the weave she was the goddess of was not defined by the worst use it had ever been put to, any more than a river is defined by the actions of someone who has used it to drown people. And then, before he had fully finished processing the magnitude of what was being asked of him, she transformed him. Not suggested, not requested, with an option to decline. Mystra physically transformed Elminster Omar into a young woman. The name she gave to this new form was Elmara. The reason, stated in the lore with a clarity that leaves no room for ambiguity, was protection. Elminster, as himself, was a person with enemies who knew what he looked like, who had standing orders regarding the elimination of any surviving Omar claimant, and who moved through a city where the mage hounds operated, and the Moonclaws maintained their own network of eyes and ears. Elmara, as a young woman known to no one in any existing network of enemies, was invisible in the way that only a genuinely new identity can be invisible. The transformation was not a punishment or a test of flexibility, though it would prove to be both of those things in the way that significant experiences tend to provide multiple kinds of education simultaneously. It was a practical solution to a genuine and ongoing threat. What followed the transformation was one of the most unexpectedly formative periods in Elminster's long history. Elmara, presenting as a young woman seeking to serve Mystra, moved into the devotional life of the goddess's faith with a particular quality of sincerity that the community she joined recognized and responded to. For a few years, the person who would become the sage of Shadowdale lived as a priestess, learning the prayers and the practices, understanding Mistra's faith from the inside, not as doctrine absorbed at a distance, but as a lived relationship with the divine, shaped by daily engagement with what it actually meant to move through the world as someone whose primary orientation was toward the weave, and toward the goddess who embodied and sustained it. The anger did not disappear during this time. Based on everything the lore shows us about how deeply the loss of Helden had carved itself into him, it seems almost certain that it remained present as an undercurrent through even the quietest of the Elmara years. But the Mistran priesthood gave it a context it had never had before, a framework within which it could coexist with something else, something that was growing alongside it and would eventually exceed it. Call it purpose or understanding, or the particular kind of faith that develops not from being told what to believe, but from experiencing the object of belief directly and finding it worthy. Then Miajala Talithin arrived. She was known by the name Dark Eyes, a title that came from the distinctive quality of her eyes, dark and deep, and carrying a quality of looking that went past the surface of what it was observing and into something further down. She presented herself as a mage of considerable skill, who had found reason to involve herself with Elmara's development in the art. The lore is clear about what she truly was. Miajala Talithin was an avatar of Mistra, the goddess herself walking in mortal form through the world she sustained, taking the direct and personal role in Elminster's magical education that the situation called for. She chose not to announce this. She arrived as a person, presented herself as a person, and trained Elmara as a mage with the depth and precision of teaching that only someone with an infinite relationship to the subject being taught could provide. Under Miajala's guidance, the art opened to Elmara in a way that nothing in the years of resistance and refusal had prepared him for. The innate affinity that had always been in him, that passive magical awareness that had been present since childhood, found in this tutelage a structure that allowed it to become active. The learning was not easy. Miajala did not make it easy, and would not have done him any service if she had. She pushed the depth of his understanding at every stage, requiring not just the ability to work a spell, but the genuine comprehension of the principles underlying it, the relationship between the practitioner and the weave that made the work possible, and the responsibility that relationship carried. Elminster learned magic the way Mistra needed him to learn it. Not as a tool, not as a weapon, as a relationship. It was Miajala who brought Elmara to the ancient archmage named Ander. Ander was a figure from a much earlier age of the world, a survivor of Nethril in the most literal sense, a mage who had lived through the fall of that great arcane empire, and carried in his memory and his craft the working knowledge of a tradition that most of the world only knew as history. He was, by any ordinary measure, extraordinarily old and extraordinarily powerful, and he lived in the particular way that certain very old and very powerful people live, quietly, and without the need for demonstration. Miajala brought Elmara to him for a specific and practical purpose. He taught Elmara the spell that could transform her back, the restoration of Elminster's original form was not presented in the lore as a simple undoing or a moment of relief. After years lived as Elmara, after the priestess work and the magical training, and the profound shift in perspective that both had generated, returning to the physical form of Elminster Omar was its own kind of transition. He was not the same person who had been transformed in the sealed temple. He was someone who had been Elmara, who carried that entirely, who had learned things about the world and about himself that the person he was before the transformation could not have accessed. Both were genuinely him. The years as Elmara were not a disguise he was glad to be free of. They were part of who he was, and he walked back into his male form with that understanding intact. Miajala continued to train him. His command of the art deepened through the months that followed the restoration, and the broader picture of what Mistra needed from him, what the whole long arc of his preparation had been building toward, became increasingly clear. The Mage Lords were still in Athelanter. Balor still sat on the stag throne. Undarl still held the position of Mage Royal. The kingdom that had been Elminster's birthright, the land of the Delimbier Vale, and the quiet villages, and the morning mist over the meadows, was still living under the gray weight of a regime that had been built on the ruins of his family. He was not the same person who had fled it. He was not the frightened 12-year-old who had come back to Helden at night and found Ash. He was not the brigand in the Horn Hills, or the thief moving through Haystarl's shadows under a false name. He was Elminster Omar, last heir of the Stag Throne, trained in the art by a goddess's own avatar, carrying years of understanding about what the Mage Lords had cost not just him, but every person in the kingdom he intended to take back. And now, for the first time, he was ready to go home. Section 5, The Reckoning at Haystarl. The year was 240 of the Dale Reckoning. The lore calls it the Year of the Chosen, a name that the Forgotten Realms calendar had assigned to it long before anyone living through that year understood how precisely the name would apply to what happened inside it. Elminster Omar was 28 years old. He had spent 16 years outside the kingdom that had been taken from him, shaped by the Horn Hills and the streets of Haystarl and the sealed temple, and the years as Elmara and the training under Miajala. And now all of that preparation had arrived at its purpose. Miajala walked with him as he began the campaign. She had been with him through the training and the restoration and the long process of becoming ready. And she was with him now, which meant that Mistra herself, in the form she had chosen to wear through all these years beside him, was present in the final act of a story she had been shaping since before Elminster was born. If he understood at this point what Miajala truly was, the lore does not record it explicitly. What it records is that they moved together, and that her presence at his side carried the weight of something more than companionship. The allies they gathered were not assembled through any single dramatic summoning. They came together through the long threads of relationship and loyalty and shared grievance that Elminster had been building, sometimes deliberately and sometimes without fully knowing it, across all the years since the dragon came to Helden. From the deep wood came the elves of the high forest, whose border ran along the northern edge of what had once been Athelanter's territory, and who had their own relationship to what the Mage Lords had done to that land, their own reasons for wanting the kingdom restored to something other than what it had become under Balor and the Cabal. They were not a large contingent, but they did not need to be large to change the calculation of a fight. From the Horn Hills came Helm Stoneblade and the Knights of Athlanter, older now than when a 12-year-old grieving boy had been brought into their rough company, but carrying the same refusal that had defined them through all the intervening years. They had waited a long time for this. The lore implies they had never stopped waiting. Whatever else the years of brigand life in the hills had done to them, it had not eroded the specific loyalty that had held them together as a community. And they arrived for the campaign with the particular quality of purpose that belongs to people who have been holding something in reserve for a very long time and have finally been told the moment to use it has come. From Haystarl itself came Farl and the Velvet Hands. They were inside the city already, which gave the assault something the other elements of the Alliance could not provide. They knew the streets. They knew the guard rotations that the magelords had been running for years. They knew which officials in the city's administrative structure had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, and which ones had committed themselves so deeply to the existing arrangement that they would need to be managed carefully when the arrangement ended. The Velvet Hands were not a military force in any conventional sense. They were something more precise and more useful for the specific geography of a city assault. They were people who knew where everything was. The assault on Haystarl came in the year 240 of the Dale Reckoning, with the decisive momentum of something that had been building for 16 years. The city the magelords had controlled, and the court of Balor Omar that had provided their arrangement with a face of Omar legitimacy. Both of those things met the gathered force of elves and outlaws and thieves, and a 28-year-old wizard carrying a Godestot command of the art, and they did not hold. The Magelord Cabal had spent years assuming that their suppression of magical potential across Athlanter, and their Magehound apparatus, and their Moonclaws, and their administrative control of every functional system in the kingdom added up to permanence. They had built their assumptions on the foundation of a long absence of effective challenge. And that foundation turned out to be far less solid than the time involved had made it seem. Undarl Dragonrider, Mage Royal of Athlanter, the figure who had ridden to Helden on a dragon and killed Elthrin Omar, and destroyed the village, and set in motion everything that followed, was defeated. The lore records this with the same directness it records his original attack, without the ornament of extended ceremony. He was overcome. So was Balor Omar, Elminster's uncle and the Puppet King, who had occupied the stag throne in the name of men, whose real instrument he had always been. Both were gone. The stag banner could fly again over Haystarl with something genuine behind it. Elminster, last legitimate heir of the stag throne, the prince whose survival the magelords had spent years trying to prevent, stood in the court of Haystarl with the full right of succession available to him. He did not take it. The lore is straightforward about this. He had no desire for kingship. He had never been building toward a throne. He had been building toward a liberation. And those are not the same thing. And he was honest enough with himself and clear enough about where his path was pointed to know the difference. He turned the rulership of Athlanter over to Helm Stoneblade, the outlaw knight who had found a grief-wrecked 12-year-old in the dark, and brought him in and waited 16 years for a dawn that could actually use his loyalty. There is an elegance in that handover that the lore allows to speak without much elaboration. The right person receiving the right thing at the end of a very long road. The night that followed was celebration, the particular quality of release that comes after a sustained tension finally resolves into something other than endurance. The people of Haystarl, who had been living under the gray weight of the Magelord's presence for as long as most of them could remember, responded to its removal with the kind of feeling that surfaces in crowds when something genuinely changes rather than just appearing to. Elminster moved through that celebration as someone who was already, in some interior sense, on the other side of it, already facing the direction of what came next. The following morning, he and Miajala left. They walked out of Haystarl along the road that led away from the city toward the south. And for a stretch of time, the lore gives us no particular drama. Just the early light on the road and two figures moving through it, carrying the specific kind of quiet that follows a completed thing. The kingdom was behind them. The work that had been the defining fact of Elminster's entire conscious life was done. Whatever came next was genuinely open in a way that nothing had been since the dragon came. Then Undarl found them on the road. What revealed itself was not the wizard who had been defeated in Haystarl. It was the truth of what that wizard had always been. Undarl, the figure who had ridden a dragon to Helden and killed Elminster's family, and served as the Magelord's most powerful instrument across all the years of their reign, had never been human. He was a Malagrim. The Malagrim were creatures of deep and ancient darkness, shapeshifters from a place entirely removed from the ordinary world, beings who could wear any form with perfect fidelity and hold it indefinitely, who had learned to move through humanoid civilization using its own trust against it. The one who had worn the name Undarl had been doing so in service of something larger, an attempt to subvert and reshape Athlanter as a foothold for the Malagrim's kind in the world of mortals. Everything the Magelords had done had served that purpose at its root, though this could imply that even the human members of the Cabal may not have understood whose instrument they truly were. The face at the top of their hierarchy had never been a man with ambitions. It had been something that wore the shape of a man and held ambitions of a wholly different and far more dangerous order. on the road out of Haystarl, the Malagrim dropped the shape it had maintained through the defeat in the city and attacked with its true nature. The battle that followed was the last and most honest version of the confrontation that had been at the core of Elminster's entire story. Not the political maneuvering and the gradual suppression and the long grinding oppression of a kingdom. Not the arranged coup and the puppet king and the mage-hound apparatus. The raw and direct violence of what had always been underneath all of that, finally visible and finally in the open. Elminster fought it with the art and with the lion's sword. The broken blade, the fragment of the stag throne's symbol that he had carried since the night he knelt in the ruins of Helden, and lifted the only inheritance the dragon had left him, proved to matter in the most specific and practical sense. He drove the lion's sword into the Malagrim's true form, bypassing the defenses that conventional magic could not penetrate. And in doing so, he finished the thing that the battle inside Haystarl had started. But in the course of that fight, Miajala fell, or appeared to. The lore describes the moment with the weight it deserves, because what Elminster experienced in that moment was grief of a very particular kind. The grief of someone who had already lost everything once, and who had found, in the years that followed, one person who had walked beside him through all of it, and who now appeared to have been taken as well. He mourned her. The grief came out as grief tends to come out after a long containing, suddenly and completely. And in the depth of it, he said aloud that he would give up magic, that he would forswear the art, that the cost of everything it touched was too high, and he was done. She told him not to say that. Her voice, which should not have been available to him, given what had just appeared to happen to her, reached him from the silver light that was beginning to gather around her form. And in that light, which was not the light of the world, but something that came from underneath the world's ordinary illuminations, Miajala Talithin opened into who she truly was. The avatar dissolved, not ending but revealing, the way a held breath releases into something larger than the holding. She was Mistra. She had always been Mistra. Every conversation across the training months, every lesson about the art and the weave and the relationship between a practitioner and the thing they practiced, every moment of genuine human connection that had felt so real because it was real, had been the goddess in mortal form, close enough to touch, choosing closeness over distance in the education of someone she had been watching since before his birth. She offered him the chosen mantle. What this meant, stated plainly, was everything. The chosen of Mistra are not simply powerful mages in her service. They are individuals in whom she has placed something of herself, through whom the weave runs more fully and more deeply than through any ordinary practitioner, who carry within them a living connection to the goddess that transcends the ordinary relationship between a worshipper and the object of their worship. She was asking him to become not just her servant, but her anchor in the world, a point through which the weave itself was tethered to the physical reality of Faerun. The silver fire that is the mark and the gift of the chosen, pure and direct power drawn from the weave at a level no ordinary magic can approach, was the expression of that relationship made tangible. He accepted. The witnesses the lore preserves for this moment are fittingly entirely ordinary. A cheese merchant and his wife, moving along the road toward Haystarl in the early morning with their cart, came around a hill and found the road behind them lit by a sphere of silver light. What they saw within it, they apparently could not quite interpret in any category their daily lives had prepared them for, and they lost control of their cart in the confusion. It is a detail so specific and so grounded in ordinary human reaction that it has a quality of truth that more dramatic framings would have lacked. The world-changing moments of legend, when they actually happen, tend to occur right next to cheese carts and startled people with perfectly unremarkable days ahead of them. Elminster walked away from Athlanter that morning carrying everything it had given him, and everything Mystra had added to it. His destination was Cormenther, the great forest where the elven city of myth Draenor waited at the height of its ancient glory. A place of accumulated wisdom and arcane tradition that could offer the next chapter of an education that was going to last centuries. Behind him, the Malagrim, who had dubbed him the enemy and sworn to destroy him for killing one of their own on that road, added a new thread to the long and complicated story of his life, one that would surface and resurface across generations. Ahead of him, the breadth of Faerun's history opened out in every direction, full of places he had not yet been, and people he had not yet met, and events that needed someone with exactly his particular combination of capability and understanding and hard-won character to be present for them. He was no longer simply the last prince of a kingdom whose story had ended that morning. He was something new, shaped by loss and road and transformation and faith, and a goddess's patient, lifelong investment. He was the beginning of Elminster the Sage, the old mage, the chosen, the figure whose name would still be spoken with reverence 1,000 years from that morning, on a road outside Haystarl, when the cheese merchant picked his wheels back up and tried to make sense of what he had just seen. The long life was just starting, and it would be extraordinary. Thank you so much for spending the time here. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.